I pulled the solo security shift that night. Docking Bay 34 is usually a graveyard at this hour. High above, the massive ventilation fans ground out a heavy, exhausted hum. It was a low-frequency vibration, exactly like a sleeping beast pulling in slow breaths, filtering the chill air of the bay. I was hunched over my console. My bracket eyes scanned the dimly lit feeds purely out of habit. Down on the floor, a heavy maintenance hydro wrench rested on an abandoned utility cart. Smears of thick grease and oxidized coolant stained its metallic surface. It was just a standard tool left behind by a tired engineer. At that moment, it was nothing more than a dense piece of iron. The deck plating trembled slightly. Others might have missed it. My lower appendages housed microsensors that flared into immediate alert. Saskia was down there. She was entirely alone. The thick rubber soles of her boots squeaked softly against the grated floor. A bare-skinned, unarmored Deathworlder. Every species on this station knew the physical anomalies of humanity. Station gossip always inflated their actual threat level. Saskia looked utterly unconcerned in her standard-issue off-duty fatigues. I thought I understood humans by now. They possess a bizarre inherent laziness. They always seem to calculate lethal danger a fraction of a second too late. There was a profound sluggishness in her posture. The ambient cold of the bay seemed to be sinking into her brittle bones. I fully intended to log off my system and cycle back to my quarters. Would you have held your ground against an impossible pack? Because she didn't even blink. The proximity warnings on my secondary monitor began flashing amber. I magnified the sensor grid. 7 distinct, highly aggressive biosignatures were moving rapidly through the transit corridors. Theslin and Pharessi heat trails bled out from the shadowed alcoves of the bay. They were all converging on a single terminal point. That isolated human signature stood dead center. In a standard survival scenario, seeing those numbers would trigger immediate panic in any rational prey species. Heart rate skyrockets. Flight responses engage. The telemetry scrolling across my screen for Saskia remained entirely flat. She wasn't running. She stood perfectly still. She was tracking their approach with casual sweeps of her eyes. This was not a natural biological reaction. My own pulse began to accelerate. Madness. Why did she stop moving? What happened next completely shattered my understanding of security protocols. The 7 senior cadets emerged from the gloom and systematically blocked every exit route. A massive Theslin pack leader spearheaded the formation. The dim overhead lights fractured and reflected harshly off his deflective mirror-scale armor. His body language radiated absolute dominance. The pack stalked toward the fragile girl. Beside him, 2 Orvani cadets tasted the air. Their gravitational whiskers trembled with clear predatory excitement. I rested my hand heavily on the emergency intercom stud. They had the solitary human completely boxed in against a heavy cargo lifter. I knew I had to call for an armed backup squad immediately, except Saskia let out a long, audible sigh. She didn't drop into a defensive stance. She simply reached out and picked up that heavy hydro wrench from the cart. I expected her to swing it like a bludgeon. I braced for a desperate, flailing attempt to preserve her own life. She did nothing of the sort. She planted the heavy tool squarely on the deck plates. She leaned her entire body weight against it, treating it exactly like a comfortable resting post at a local cantina. Is this the part where I'm supposed to look serious? Saskia's voice echoed through the cavernous bay. There was zero fear in her pitch. Her tone dripped with raw, unfiltered sarcasm. The Theslin leader bristled with sudden rage. His mirror scales flared outward. They locked into place for a lethal kinetic strike. My bracket biology screamed a warning. The plasma venom glands clustered at the base of my neck pulsed involuntarily. It was a sickening mixture of raw fear and absolute awe. Looking at the unprotected human, I prepared myself for the sickening sound of snapping bones. A Pharessi cadet vented a thin stream of toxic vapor from his acid weeper ducts. They were pushing their intimidation tactics to the absolute maximum limit. They honestly believed they controlled the board. Saskia tilted her head just a fraction of an inch. Her expression carried the deep, bone-weary exhaustion of someone dealing with a minor administrative delay. It was not the face of someone caught in a lethal ambush. "My shift ended 20 minutes ago," she stated calmly. She adjusted her grip lazily on the wrench. "If you guys want to get beaten into the deck, I'm gonna have to file for overtime." The Thessalin unleashed a guttural roar and launched himself through the air. He targeted her unprotected chest cavity. I knew his extended claws could shear through space dock bulkheads. I stared at the visual feed and stopped breathing entirely. The girl didn't even flinch. She simply shifted the angle of her rubber boots against the floorboards. A sharp, resonant grounding snap cracked through the air. The Thessalin pack leader lunged, mirror scales flaring for a lethal kinetic strike. A strike that never landed. Saskia didn't swing the heavy hydro wrench. She didn't drop into a recognized martial stance. She merely lifted the tool a few inches off the deck, using its raw, dense mass as a structural barrier. The alien collided heavily with the solid iron. The kinetic impact reverberated through the cavernous bay, rattling the nearest diagnostic monitors. Instantly, the alien attempted to discharge a massive bioelectric stun straight from his forearms into her metal tool, fully expecting her nervous system to fry. The floor simply absorbed it. Because of her grounded posture, the lethal voltage routed flawlessly through her dense skeletal structure, down the thick insulation of her rubber-soled boots, and directly into the station's grounding grid. It was an involuntary, deeply ingrained evolutionary instinct forged on a death world with a highly volatile molten magnetic core. She barely even blinked at the lethal surge. "You're fast," she noted calmly, shifting her weight slightly to maintain leverage against the massive alien. "But your routing is incredibly predictable." The Orvani cadets rushed her exposed flanks. Their gravitational whiskers twitched frantically, trying to sense her microscopic shifts in momentum, but she wasn't moving like cornered prey. Above them, a rhythmic, mundane dripping of a leaky coolant valve echoed from the overhead pipes, ticking away the seconds of their total failure in a perfect, agonizing sequence. The Thessalin leader scrambled backward, his prized mirror scales shedding violently and clattering against the grating from the sheer blunt force of the block. "Increased pressure," he roared to the Pharessi flankers, panic finally bleeding into his guttural voice. "We are already at maximum," one of the Orvani wheezed. His acid weeper ducts were running completely dry from exhaustion, his chest heaving as he realized his supreme physical speed was entirely useless against a target that refused to break formation. One desperate Pharessi managed a sweeping grapple from her blind spot, catching Saskia's left hand and twisting hard. Her thumb dislocated outward at an unnatural angle. My security console immediately registered the bone leaving its socket. Any normal civilized species would have instantly collapsed into a paralyzing neuroshock, their biological system shutting down to manage the excruciating pain. Instead, Saskia let out a mild groan of annoyance. She casually pressed the disjointed knuckle against the hard steel edge of the cargo lifter, snapped it back into place, and shoved the horrified cadet backward into a bulkhead without ever breaking eye contact with the pack leader. Another security officer stepped into my monitoring booth, staring blankly at the live feeds. "She didn't even drop her wrench," he whispered, his vocal cords tightening in raw disbelief. My tactical screens suddenly lit up with severe localized anomaly warnings. I watched my telemetry screens completely max out as her biology flooded with over 200 billion fresh red blood cells a day, rapidly oxygenating her muscles to a degree that made the exhausted, panting alien predators look like they were moving in slow motion. Her skin began to flush a deep, alarming red. She was radiating a mild mineral-etching acid purely as a byproduct of her hypermetabolism shifting into a combative gear. The surrounding air grew visibly hazy around her shoulders. The remaining cadets began to back away, their predatory instincts entirely overridden by sheer survival terror. Their mirror scales lost their rigid, aggressive posture, slumping downward in pure biological exhaustion. They were completely outclassed. They had cornered a supposedly fragile Deathworlder, expecting an easy victim to intimidate. They found an apex predator who was highly annoyed by an unapproved overtime dispute. Within 3 short minutes, All 7 senior cadets were fully incapacitated, clutching broken appendages or gasping for breath on the cold deck plating, while Saskia quietly logged her exit code at the terminal. We drastically increased the security detail for all engineering sectors the very next morning. But the undeniable truth is, the head xenobiologist requested an immediate transfer to another sector because he finally realized our heavily armed guards weren't there to protect her. We were just a captive audience. The bay doors locked with a heavy, resonant thud. A deep silence finally settled over the cavernous space, but the crushing atmospheric pressure never actually dropped. The 7 exhausted cadets lay scattered across the cold grating. Saskia was already gone. Only the hydro wrench remained, leaning casually against the dented cargo lifter, still carrying the faint, terrifying warmth of a nightmare.